Okay, if I'm not coming through okay, let me know. I'm going to make sure that everything's actually working this time because the last two times I seem to have screwed it up in completely different ways. Okay, so this is going to be part 3 of Subversion and Racial Unrest. If you didn't see part 1 or part 2, this book is the transcription of minutes from public hearings that were held in the state of Louisiana in the legislature in 1957. It was dealing with issues of desegregation, which was on its way, and communist subversion, which had been happening in the United States since the 19 teens. And as the Southern politicians who were segregationists were looking at what was coming and they were trying to figure out what to do about it, they were noticing that in certain places there were alliances between communists and desegregationists. So that got them into this communist stuff. Ready to snap. Hey there. So that got him into looking more into the history of communism in the United States. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off last time. The committee, we're on page 44 if you happen to ever get this book through interlibrary loan. And they've had their recess and they're ready to go again. Now, I've got the picture up of Willie Rainach as the person asking the questions here, but it's not actually going to be him. It's going to be a guy named William Shaw, who was from, I believe, Minden, Louisiana, which is in north central Louisiana, and it's a small town. And he would have died, I think, in something like 2005. At this point, he was the general counsel for the state of Louisiana, or maybe for just this section, maybe just for this joint legislative committee. I'm not really sure. But I couldn't find a picture of William Shaw. Oh, I'm sorry, I said Minden. It's actually Homer, Louisiana, which is a different small town in that area. Either way, we're going to get into it. Mr. Shaw asks, Mr. Kornfeder, we have been talking here about a period from 1935 to 1939. Now, you were no longer in the party, that is the Communist Party, at that time. Is this correct? Kornfeder replies, that's correct, but I am very familiar with their operations. Shaw asks, do you mind telling the committee how you continued your familiarity with the operations during that time? Kornfeder replies, well, since I know their basic methods of operation, strategy, and tactics and organization, it's relatively easy for me to follow what they do by reading publications and by meeting party members who have quit them and who were leading members. Party members who have quit the Communist Party but were leading members when they were in it. Every once in a while, whenever there's a new turn in party line, somebody, as it were, drops off the wagon and rebels against the new turn. And I and others eventually manage to see them and find out what has been going on inside of their kitchen for periods that they have not been in. Shaw asks, now we have some reference to the CIO and the fact that it was chartered by a number of known communist unions. That was back during this period that we're speaking of. 35 to 39, was it not? Kornfeder replies, that's right. Shaw asks, since that time, isn't it true that they have made some rather extensive efforts to clean up and remedy this situation? Kornfeder replies, oh yes, definitely so. I intended to come to that in its proper sequence in the testimony. But since you are now asking the question, yes, this whole thing has been reversed. As a matter of fact, the CIO took the lead in cleaning up on the communist-controlled unions. They threw them all out, though the communists still have some pockets here and there. But as far as the nationally chartered unions, they have all been excluded as being communist-controlled unions, and as being unions not controlled by their members and which did not follow the policies of the CIO, but the policies laid down by Moscow. On these two grounds, they have been thrown out of the CIO. Some of them still exist with a great loss of membership. For instance, the United Electrical Radio Equipment Workers, which were under the early CIO and had 800,000 members, They are reduced to about 100,000 now and outside the CIO. And there is, of course, Bridges Waterfront Union, which has not suffered as much as the others that were thrown out and still keeps a hold on a number of very important points. There is still the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Union, which has lost more than half its membership after they were thrown out of the CIO. But as a big force operating under the auspices of the CIO, no communist can do that anymore. The CIO won't tolerate it. Hold on. I just crashed here. Let me pull my window back up. It's Firefox for you. I think I'm still streaming, but my browser crashed. Okay. All right, I think we're definitely working again. Shaw asks, during this period, was there liaison between the NAACP and the Negro and other fronts of the Communist Party? Kornfeder asks, during what period? Shaw replies, the period we're discussing, 1935 to 1939. Kornfeder replies, oh yes, of course, indeed. As I said, the National Negro Congress was a joint enterprise in which the Negro organizations participated. Of course, that came to a stop during 1939 and 1941 during the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And since Moscow... Hey there, Gabe. Give it a look when I unpack. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of dry historical information, but it is interesting. If it's interesting or not, just let me know, by the way. That would be good to get some feedback. Okay, and since Moscow then started to play the old game against the democracies and allied itself with Nazi Germany, the whole policy of courting the democracies was, of course, abandoned, and they went back to hostilizing the democracies. In the Negro field, they revived the slogan of a Negro Republic in the South. Their propaganda called the war between democracies and Nazi Germany a white man's war, and the Negro shouldn't be cannon fodder for the white man, and so on and so forth. So the kind of combinations as were represented by the National Negro Congress and some of the other fronts sort of went to pieces during that period. They didn't go to completely to pieces because the alliance with Hitler didn't last long enough. But the party was on the way then to reorientating its policy and creating new fronts designed on the basis of the new alliance. But before those fronts before a new type of front got going, Hitler attacked Russia, and, well, the old marriage came together again of the democracies becoming allies with Soviet Russia, and the Trojan horse became a partner once again. William Shaw asks, now during the time that you're speaking of, in what way did this manifest itself with special reference to the Negroes? What way did the Communist Party's change of line during this particular period manifest itself with regard to the Negroes? You know, we're going to skip this part because I'm pretty sure that during the first couple of videos, or first couple of sections of this, that Kornfeder already talked about all that. So let me skip ahead just a little bit. Well, this is good right here. Okay. So Shaw asks, well, what happened after June 1941 when Hitler broke his alliance with Stalin and invaded Russia? Kornfeder replies, well, then the old line came back on the double, according to democracies, and in fact, the communists then went even further. They became super patriots, but not for the United States, for Soviet Russia. And the United States wasn't doing things fast enough to defeat Hitler. They, being the Communist Party, suppressed strikes. Even unions who had legitimate grievances and otherwise would have gone out on strikes. The communist leadership discouraged these. The whole incitement amongst the Negro subsided completely. And on the contrary, they wanted the Negro to become a good patriot for the war effort. That is the whole thing in reverse. Hey there, No Heart. Thank you for the compliment. Good to see you too. That is the whole thing in reverse, not for the sake of the United States, of course, but in order to save Soviet Russia from defeat. They pressured the United States to greater efforts and discouraged all agitation of organizations that would obstruct such an effort. During that period, they became even more associated with other Negro organizations like the NAACP, and the same thing took place amongst the whites. They became the most consistent, for that period, supporters of the war effort. And all this makes perfect sense because if you have ever looked into the America First groups, the American nationalist groups, people like Charles Lindbergh, people like the Silver Legion, Pelley, and all those kind of people, they were almost, even Lillian Gish, the famous silent movie actress. If you've ever looked into any of those people, you'll find that most of them were, although they were nationalists, they were not quite pacifist, but definitely isolationist. They didn't see the point in getting involved in European wars, and they definitely didn't see the point in saving the Soviet Union from defeat. But we know that they completely lost out, and I think that there are 2 good episodes of they're all good, but 2 excellent episodes of Myth of the 20th Century where they talk about Red Hollywood. One of the things that they specifically point out is how the Hollywood Anti-Fascist League was really big before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then it basically went dormant until Hitler declared war on Soviet Russia. But during that period in which the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was in place, all of these Soviet agents, were saying, we need to be peaceful and pacifistic and all that stuff. And as soon as war's declared, they just all spin on a dime. So that's how you know, that's how you know all these people are totally controlled by the Soviet Union. And that you don't even have to argue against them directly and assume good faith because, it's already proven immediately that they're operating in bad faith. Okay, so the NAACP became more friendly than ever with the National Negro Congress. The NAACP allowed communist authors to write articles in The Crisis, which would have been the NAACP's national magazine or bulletin or publication. They recommended communist-authored books in their various book recommendations section. The leaders of the NAACP then joined various Negro fronts of the Communist Party and other fronts of the Communist Party operating in other fields. Well, it was a sort of honeymoon situation, of course, which the communists, who always had ulterior motives, took full advantage. In other words, there was no need for the tricky infiltration you speak of. This is Shaw speaking. In other words, there was no need for the tricky infiltration you spoke of in connection with the Trojan horse matter. The welcome mat was out for them, and they were welcomed instead of having to sneak in. Is that right? Kornfeder replies, that's right, that's exactly right. Shaw asks, would you say that this was the high point of communist infiltration, both ideologically and organizationally, into all of these various organizations? Kornfeder replies, that was the high point of their infiltration, ideological and organizational, especially organizational. The gates were simply open for them, and not only in reference to labor unions and other social organizations, but the gates were open to them in the United States government. That's when the big infiltration took place into the U.S. government and its various agencies. Shaw asks, what effect did this partnership with communism have on the Negro colleges and the Negro press in general? Kornfeder replies, well, of course, that was the time when they infiltrated the Negro colleges. In fact, that was the time when they infiltrated all colleges, more successfully, including the Negro colleges. That was the time when they made the biggest headway amongst the sociological intelligentsia and the professors and teachers who teach economics and sociology and government and history and so on and so forth. So Kornfeder is telling us here that the communist subversion of academia happened during the 1940s, especially after Germany broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, And we all know that it goes earlier than that, but it's just an interesting observation that, like when these people see that the United States is openly allied with the Soviet Union, it's a different situation than which FDR is having to operate through back channels in order to supply the Soviet Union with, millions and millions and millions of dollars of U.S. built military products, while the United States is supposed to be in an economic depression and supposed to be unable to take care of its own people and infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. They're actually doing it all through the back door. But when you have an open alliance, then these people no longer have to pretend that they're not communists or pinkos or fellow travelers or whatever, and everybody just comes out into the open. Apparently what happened. On the myth of the 20th century, I made one comment there about Ronald Fisher and about how Ronald Fisher, the famous British statistician, biologist, and eugenist, he came to Ames, Iowa in 1936, and he got along great with everybody and had a really fun time. 10 years later, Fisher was back, and his biographer, who was his daughter in this book I was reading, she said that the intellectual climate in the United States had changed, and that from 36 to 46, something was different. Fisher's ideas were no longer part of the American mainstream, and he was now kind of an outsider. They still respected him deeply. They were very excited to have him, but something had changed in the American intellectual character and at these big universities. So maybe it was something like communists infiltrating everything and openly preaching their doctrine, right? So that's just one interesting thing to look at here that he's bringing out. It seems that the intellectuals had during that time shown a remarkable weakness. They were bigger suckers for the communist propaganda than many others were, apparently because they led sort of a life apart from the daily troubles and toils of the population. They were the ivory tower boys who picked up the theories of communists, not looking at what is behind the theories. And that applied, of course, to the Negro colleges also. I may perhaps at this time, if it's all right with you, give you an indication of the import of that infiltration in, let's say, into the NAACP during that particular period. Most of those that I can mention here, I only have a few. He's ESL, I can't quite get that. Most of those that I can mention here, I only have a few. Shaw asks, let me preface that. You have done a particular study of this subject with regard to the NAACP, have you not? Kornfeder replies, I have. Shaw asks, you have in your files information, is that right? Kornfeder replies, that's correct. Shaw asks, is that what you propose to offer at this time to the committee? Kornfeder replies, just in order to illustrate the point of infiltration into this particular organization during that time. Is that all right? Shaw says, that's fine if you wish to go ahead. Kornfeder replies, well, I have here, and then he gets cut off. Shaw says, excuse me, well, after this, but please identify each one as you place an exhibit into evidence. So Shaw's a lawyer, right? So he's trying to make sure that this newly introduced material is properly admitted into the record, so that when we're reading this later, we know what's going on. Kornfeder replies, I have here the record of affiliation with, sponsorship association with, communist fronts of a number of NAACP leaders. I only have those who have more than 10 affiliations each to their credit. I don't mention the others, figuring that an individual who has 10 affiliations should know that he was affiliated with something. So here you have the chairman of the board of the NAACP, Channing H. Tobias. He has to his credit 42 fronts. Among them, there are 8 Negro fronts. When I say Negro fronts, I mean fronts created by the Communist Party for operation amongst Negroes. Now, I think I may have already talked about this before, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize it for you. What he's talking about here is he's got Channing Tatum, or excuse Channing Tobias, pardon me. He's got Channing Tobias as a member of 42 NGOs or nonprofits, let's say, and 10 of them turned out to be communist operated. So, for example, he was a member of one called the American Committee for Yugoslav Relief. He was a sponsor for that. Another one is called the American Roundtable on India. Another one is the American Slavic Congress. Okay, so Channing Tobias is affiliated with or going to these different organizations, which are not communist. However, there's one here called Conference on Puerto Rico's Right to Freedom. That one is alleged to be a communist organization. There's another one called Council on African Affairs, also a communist organization. So he's a member of 40-something, and then 10 of them are communist fronts, is what Kornfeder's alleging. Now, let's skip ahead here. Kornfeder says, now, according to another important leader on the board of directors of the NAACP is the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. She has to her credit 33 fronts, of which she has either been a member or a sponsor or an associate. 4 of these fronts were of the Communist Party operating amongst the Negroes. So what have we got here? We've got the All Harlem Youth Conference. Let's see. Christmas amnesty plea for communists convicted under the Smith Act. I think I did talk about that before. So what he's going to do is he's going to go through and do the same kind of analysis for the vice president of the NAACP, another vice president, another member of the board of directors, all these different people, and he's got pages and pages of this stuff here, if I can just show it, for example. I don't know if you can read that, but these are just lists of these various organizations, and then the ones that are affiliated or the ones that are alleged to be communist groups. And that's going to go on, for like another 40 or 50 pages. I'm going to skip ahead from all that. Let's talk about what it's like after you have to... No, let's do this here. I believe this is still going to be Shaw asking these questions. Yeah, this is still Shaw. Okay, this is just some interesting information about the actual operation of this Communist Party. I will try to do that. This is Kornfeder speaking. I will try to do that, sort of make a basic definition of communist infiltration methods. Well, first of all comes, of course, the acceptance of the basic documents of communism. Now, those who accept the basic doctrine may become members of the Communist Party or may just be fellow travelers, but they are the hardcore of communist influence because when they have accepted the doctrine, they have, as it were, a rounded out social perspective of doing away with the existing social system. And as I have said by the previous witness, that doctrine is based on materialism. I refer to Mr. Bannister this morning. I refer to Mr. Bannister this morning. I don't know who that is because I didn't see that in this book. Materialism is the opposite of believing in a supreme being. That doctrine, of course, is the opposite of the rule of laws and is based on the rule of classes in society. Actually, the rule of the Communist Party is based on the concept of supremacy of the government and the incidental character of the individual in the total picture. That's really interesting. So for communism, for the ideology of communism, the character of the individual is incidental. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the communist citizen is a Chinese, if they're a multiracial person of, like part black and part European background. It doesn't matter if they're coming from a Catholic culture or Shinto culture. None of this stuff matters. It doesn't matter if they have a mental disease or anything. That stuff just doesn't matter. It's all based on the government itself, right? The government and the economics. It doesn't matter about the character of the individual. And the one-party monopoly. No competition, either ideological or organizational or otherwise. One-party monopoly. Now, those who've accepted those concepts, either in totality or in substantial part, they are the hardcore of communism, whether they are whether they are members at the time or not. Now, for instance, the Communist Party had a tremendous turnover. According to the FBI, they are only supposed to have about 20,000 members. But the number of individuals to join the Communist Party in the United States since its creation goes into 600,000. Many of those who have come and gone out still have in their minds the communist doctrine, although they have quit the party as an organization. Amongst the Negroes, they have had an even bigger percentage of turnover of membership. Of about 40,000 Negroes who joined the Communist Party since 1925, the present estimate of Negroes in the Communist Party is as low as 1,600. But many of these 40,000 still have a substantial part of the communist doctrine in their minds. Of course, there are others who quit and eventually freed themselves of these doctrines. That's what the basic element in communist ideological infiltration. That is the basic element of communist ideological infiltration, out of which communist organizations eventually form. Well, let's say that on the basis of that, one individual is a communist. Now, out of that comes another type of ideological infiltration, the acceptance of strategic doctrine or formulas, which in this case is Negro racial nationalism. Of course, in the case of workers or other strata, it may be another subsidiary derivative of the major doctrine. These they call unifying slogans. Well, in the case of the Negroes, it's just a matter of Negroes becoming a nation as a race. You see, this is different from other concepts of nations. Until Stalin borrowed this concept from Hitler, a nation was conceived of as several million persons who speak the same language, live in the same area for centuries, and have certain unifying cultural characteristics. And the question as to whether they were originally German or Slavs or Frenchmen didn't enter into it. But on the basis of this, well, assuming that would be projected generally, then all the whites throughout the world should be one nation, just as all the Negroes throughout the world should be one nation. This is kind of interesting, but I would really like to ask Kornfeder, if he were still alive today, is it possible to turn someone from Nigeria into a German or a Slav or a Frenchman? Because clearly you can look at, there's plenty of examples in European culture of people being absorbed into English ethnicity or German or French, like those things are kind of generated over time, and everybody recognizes that, including the shitlibs who love to point out the fact that this stuff is malleable and that ethnicity can change over time, and that there's a component of it that's identitarian rather than just purely historical or biological or cultural or racial or whatever. But I guess Kornfeder probably just can't even imagine a universe in which the one like we're occupying today, because for him it's just, basically Europeans who don't really look that distinct from one another are changing ethnicity. Anyhow, it is interesting, however, that he does bring up the concept of, universal white nationalism as a thought experiment here, as a complementary idea to the universal black nationalism that the Soviet Union was promoting, or Garvey for that matter. There's really not too much difference between the Garveyite stuff and the worldwide Negro nationalism that we're talking about here, except that the communists had to kill the Garvey movement because they weren't in control of it, right? It's really the only thing that bothered them. Same thing in the Spanish Civil War, right? If you don't have control of it, you have to destroy it. Sorry for rambling. The Negroes who don't accept the communist doctrine as a whole, but accept this particular derivative, they will be the next element, the nearest one with which the communists could work, because they have accepted a strategic concept originated by the communists. Well, these would be 10 to every single communist who accepted the entire communist doctrine. Then you come down further. That's the one you're probably most familiar with. a minor thought pattern which relates to action slogans. In the case of Negroes, let's say, equal rights for Negroes. In the case of workers, let's say, a 6-hour day and full pensions and guaranteed annual wages, or guaranteed income for farmers. These are tactical slogans with which communists get together some strata to achieve immediate objectives. Now, in that case, you will have, for one communist, 100 others who will accept the tactical formula. So what Kornfeder is saying is that if you've got some slogan, like, for example, $15 an hour, which is something that the Bernie people or the Elizabeth Warren people, kind of like, I guess I would call them not quite shit libs, but just sort of, like deluded middle class people on the center left. The Communist Party could potentially mobilize these people by putting forth some type of tactical slogan, as he calls it. And you would have 100 of people who would be behind that for every one person who would be a hardcore ideological communist. And then in the middle, you've got like the fellow travelers or the pinkos or whatever you call them. And there would be 10 of those for every 100 people who would get behind the slogan, or 10 of those for every hardcore communist who buys the entire ideological platform from start to finish. These are the three patterns ideologically out of which the communist movement operates. It is a sort of system of wheels within wheels. The inner wheel is the communist doctrine. The next wheels are their strategic slogans, and the wheels after that are their tactical operations. Now, when one comes down to the tactical, you can have even more extensive than 100 to 1. The Communist Party is the idea factory for disruption. It's busy with that all the time. It isn't like a political party. When I read this earlier, I found this to be particularly interesting because I've worked on campaigns. Get this, okay? It isn't like a political party. Before election, the political party gets busy for 3 months and then forgets about it for 4 years. Now, I had a guy, a long-time political guy, express this exact same thing to me. What he said was that political campaigns are like butterflies. They are born, they live for a short time, and then they die, and then there's just nothing left of them. So that's what Kornfeder's saying about political parties. Busy for 3 months, and then it's done for the next 4 years. We've actually seen that that's not really the case anymore. Just a second. Okay, guys, I hate to cut this off, but I gotta go. I got a work thing I gotta do. Just to finish my thought, we're now, in like the permanent campaign cycle, and the congressional politics have basically taken over. So all of these people who are constantly campaigning for re-election for the House of Representatives, the parties have become so big. The national parties, the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, have become so big that they are ever present, always operating. And that's even outside of the presidential campaign cycle, which really brings in the hugest amount of money and exerts the most influence. But previously, he's saying that something like the Republicans or the Democrats would be chained down to these 4-year cycles, and they only really operate for 3 months. Whereas the Communist Party, on the other hand, is always working all the time, especially amongst the hardcore people who actually buy the whole platform from start to finish. That they never stop being subversive, and that they're always coming up with new ideas on how to do that, and that's kind of why the liberal democracies are so vulnerable to communist infiltration and subversion, because they're just not prepared to fight off that kind of activity. And a few guys in the legislature who are holding meetings and trying to expose this stuff can't really get a whole lot done. Okay, thank you guys for your time. I'm sorry we had to cut it short, but I'm going to try to do some more of this as soon as I can, and I appreciate your interest.